Okay, today we are going to do a record review on an EEG, which is abnormal. Okay, our sensitivity is 7 microvolts per millimeter, and our time base is 30 millimeters per second. Both of those are the recommended default settings by ACNS, the American Clinical Neurophysiology Society. And I do want to point out one thing. So the notch filter is turned on right now, the 60 hertz filter. So if we turn it off, we can see that there is some localized 60 hertz artifact within the C4 electrode as well as the P4 electrode, and maybe a little bit of 60 hertz within both the right and left occipital electrodes. So we'll go ahead and turn on the notch filter to clean up the study a little bit. And what we're seeing here is a cluster of eye blinks. So that's one of the things. So there's an eye blink, there's an eye blink, there's an eye blink, eye blink, eye blink, eye blink, eye blink, eye blink. And as we move forward with this EEG, we're going to start seeing some periodic discharges, which are generalized. But right here, I think in these 2 or 3 seconds, we can see some theta. It's low voltage, the lower voltage range. Now we can see those GPDs, which are better resolved, clearer to see. So there's one there, there's another there. These are essentially periodic sharp wave discharges, which are generalized, and they have a triphasic morphology. And you see the patient starts to blink very frequently within this span of time. Then right here we can see some really clear GPDs. So there's one there, there's another, and we're in a bipolar anterior to posterior montage, also called a double banana montage. And we have the left temporal chain on the top, followed by the left parasagittal chain, followed by the midline from front to back, or anterior to posterior, followed by the right parasagittal chain, and lastly the right temporal chain. Then of course an EKG, single lead EKG at the bottom. The frequency of these GPDs appears to be around 1 hertz, a little bit faster than 1 hertz. If it was 1 hertz, then you would see a discharge as you have here, but then the preceding one would align over this green vertical line, because the distance from one green vertical line to another, or the major grid line, is 1 second. We can prove that by just overlaying the scale legend here and looking at the horizontal line. So that's 1 second. So if they were 1 hertz, we would think we'd have a 1 here, and then 1 here, and 1 here. So these appear to be a little bit faster, probably around 1.5 hertz, 1.25 to 1.5 hertz. They also appear to have an anterior to posterior lag. So let's change our montage, and we're going to go to a ears tied referential montage. So that takes A1 and A2, adds them up, and then divides them by 2. So you kind of mitigate or reduce some of the artifact which could possibly be occurring in either of A1 or A2 electrodes. So this montage, although historically I found it to be very useful with really showcasing the morphology of such waves as GPDs with triphasic morphology, let's try an average reference and see if that showcases them better. Not too much. So perhaps if we move along a few pages here, we'll see some better formed GPDs. But I do want to add this. If you look at the segment of EEG starting approximately right here, so the 4th full second of this page, and then you look to approximately right here, so right where the scale legend happens to be, we can see that there are not so much GPDs here as there are rhythmic delta waves consistent with GRDA, or generalized rhythmic delta activity. The obsoleted term is FRDA, or frontal intermittent rhythmic delta activity, but that's obsolete. So we say GRDA, which is generalized rhythmic delta activity. And oftentimes with GPDs that have that triphasic morphology, you will see the GPDs existing on a continuum with GRDA, because it's thought that they arise from the same pathology within the cortex. So a lot of times the GRDA will have some features of GPDs with triphasic morphology, and sometimes the GPDs will have some features of GRDA, and sometimes it's just kind of this hybrid as we see here. So this is a good example of how you can see GRDA and GPDs with triphasic morphology existing on a continuum. All right, so we'll stop and look here. So the frequency here is about 1 hertz to 1.25 hertz of these GPDs. And what do we mean by triphasic morphology? Well, you have 3 phases. That's essentially what it means. So if we look in the FZ channel here, we see this initial upward deflection, so this negative deflection being recorded right here, and that's immediately followed by this downward, very prominent deflection, so that's the second phase, and followed by a more blunted third phase, which is coming back up in negative. So it's a complex of 3 phases. You have the initial wave here, which is negative. You have the second one pointing down, and again, I'm talking about the FZ channel. And then on the third phase, you have this more blunt negative wave there, and then this pattern repeats immediately. So here you see another up, down, up. So these are representative of that triphasic morphology, and there does seem to be a mild anterior to posterior lag, but I'm going to see if I can find a better example of that within this study. Got some artifact there from the tap test, and notice that with the tap test, this is a great example of how an average referential montage can have potential downfalls of an average referential montage, and some things to be on the lookout for. So if you affect one electrode to an extent that the voltage is at some hypothetical threshold, or you surpass that threshold, it's going to contaminate the rest of the electrodes. Because as long as that particular electrode, which is contaminated, or has the activity, which is of high enough amplitude, as long as it's included in the average, so the average is typically F3, C3, P3, FZ, CZ, PZ, so on and so forth, most of the electrodes on the 1020 system that we apply to the scalp. Sometimes people omit or exclude some of the electrodes, say for example FP1 and FP2, because of the plethora of eye blinks you may see, which could contaminate all of the electrodes. And sometimes folks will eliminate the O1 and O2 and perhaps others from the average, with the idea of removing any electrodes which could contaminate the remainder, or that average composite that you're going to need in the second input here. But we do see there's a tap test, and the tap test is commenced with the technologist tapping the FP1 electrode. Don't see too much artifact spreading here. And then we see F7 and then T3. That just might be their fingers are close to the other electrodes. But you do see, though, that in the right hemispheric electrodes, you have artifacts. So I think the tapping was such of an intensity here that it's affecting all of the electrodes. So it's a good example of contamination that you can expect with an average referential montage. So again, we see these triphasic waves here, generalized, but also some features of GRDA. So at times, this activity is best defined as existing on a continuum. Here's a good example of where there's underlying theta slowing. So underneath, if you will, the periodic discharges, the triphasic activity, as well as the GRDA-like slowing here, we do see some theta. So right in this range, maybe 6 hertz or so. So this is perhaps a moderate encephalopathy, depending on how you grade the encephalopathy. There are a few different grading systems. The one that I tend to refer back to is the Handbook of ICU Long-Term EEG Monitoring. They actually break it down and have a tier ranking of mild, moderate, and severe encephalopathies. And I found that to be very helpful. Of course, a severe encephalopathy would include electrocerebral silence or inactivity, right? Brain death. Of course, a mild encephalopathy would be the patient who has maybe a posterior dominant rhythm, which is just a bit under 8 hertz at times, maybe 7 hertz, 7.5 hertz, and or they have some transient or intermittent generalized slowing, but it doesn't dominate the background. Maybe it's rare or occasional. So this is a well-formed generalized sharp wave discharge with triphasic morphology. And this is also a good example of the lag. Oftentimes, GPDs with triphasic morphology will have an anterior to posterior lag, meaning that a few milliseconds after the frontal region records the sharp wave discharge, so this upward deflection, for example, right here in FZ, actually let's look up at FP1. So let's look at the deflection. I'm putting the vertical sweep edge, the red line, right at the apex of this FP1 upward deflection here. We can see that the apex, best seen in CZ, is not aligned directly underneath FP1, and for that matter F3. There's a little bit of a lag. So the apex is just following it. And if we change our time base, this will be much easier to see. So I've just zoomed in. Now we're at 60 millimeters per second. And so right now I'm at the apex, or the peak, of that first of the 3 waves of the triphasic wave. In FP1, here's the apex, or in the frontal region. But then look at CZ. So now CZ is a little bit more posterior than the frontal electrodes. So the peak's there. And then as you move further back, the peak is even more to the right. So there's a bit of a lag. All right, so let's change our time base back to the 30 millimeters per second. We do see some theta slowing embedded within the GPDs. There's some periodicity we can see here. So there's a discharge, there's another discharge, maybe quasi-periodic right here. It's going to change montages here. Okay, so I went back to the referential A1, A2 tide, and I think this page we're starting to see some good examples of that anterior to posterior lag. So let's just look at the second phase, or the downward deflection. And right now I'm looking in the F3 channel. So you can see that's the peak of that downward deflection. But then as you move posteriorly to the F3, so say for example C3, the peak of that downward wave is just to the right. So it's lagging behind. And then the same thing happens a little bit more as you move further posteriorly to P3. Or we can just concentrate. First, let's change that time base. Okay, so right now, if we just look at F3, we can see the peak of the first upward deflection. And there's not so much a lag that's as salient with the frontal electrodes in this initial upward deflection. But nonetheless, there is one there. I think it's easier to see, or more salient, if you compare this F3 to CZ. CZ is just a little bit lagging behind. And then finally to PZ. But look at the second deflection, the downward deflection. Remember, triphasic waves have 3 phases, up, down, and then up again. And we can see that the FZ peak deflection of that second wave, downward deflecting wave, is about there, in CZ. And then finally in PZ, it's even further to the right. So there's just a very subtle lag. Sometimes these are more salient. These are not as subtle. So it just depends. But I do think coming up here, we do have a good example that you'll appreciate. So if we look at the second phase, or the downward phase with this triphasic wave, I think we can really appreciate the lag. And even more so if we change that time base back to 60 millimeters per second. So I think it's better seen with this second deflection here, not the initial one so much, but especially the second one. See how the peak right here in the FC channel is approximately where I have the sweep edge, but then that peak shifts a little bit to the right as you move posteriorly, say for example to CZ, or you could say C4, and then a little bit more to the right as you move posteriorly further to P3. So there's a little bit of a lag there. It is better to see sometimes if you do zoom in or increase your time base. All right, so I'm just going to change back to a double banana montage. And we can still appreciate that periodicity we see with these GPDs. And we also see how at times the GPDs with triphasic morphology are kind of entwined with GRDA, or they can exist on a continuum together. So we see more GPD with triphasic morphology right here, and then there's more of a GRDA signature for these 3 seconds, and then it shifts back to the triphasic morphology. We can also see the lag within the anterior to posterior double banana bipolar montage. So we see there's a bit of a lag there. So the classic or the classical clinical condition associated with GPDs that have that triphasic morphology is going to be hepatic issues or issues with the liver, but really technically etiologically non-specific, but they do point to a metabolic encephalopathy. There's something metabolically abnormal or unsettled with the body. And this EEG, which was recorded for approximately 25 minutes, is more of the same of this. So we have this low voltage underlying theta slowing with some delta, of course, right? Because we have the GPDs with triphasic morphology at approximately 1.5 hertz, 1 to 1.5 hertz. At times, though, kind of hybridizing with GRDA, for example, right here. And they are both thought to arise from the same pathology. So that makes sense that you oftentimes see GRDA and GPDs with triphasic morphology together. These are well-formed GPDs with triphasic morphology, and they have a clear anterior to posterior lag. For example, in the F3-C3 channel, the second phase, which is downward deflecting, the peak is there. But if we look at the C3-P3 channel, the peak of that downward second deflection is there. And then the P301 channel, the peak of the second downward deflection is there. So there's a little bit of a lag across time. They're not all occurring synchronously. There is a synchronicity to the GPDs. So in a relative sense, they're not occurring synchronously. There's just a subtle lag. And with GPDs that have that triphasic morphology, oftentimes you can see a reverse lag in the sense that the posterior electrodes will record the discharge just a few milliseconds before you move anteriorly. So it's just basically a reverse AP lag, reverse anterior to posterior lag. We have some artifact or electrode pop, maybe from movement in O2 right there. We have some well-formed GPDs of triphasic morphology here. And then we have the end of our study. As far as the single lead EKG, the only potential abnormality, if you would even call it that I was able to ascertain was that this patient had mild borderline tachycardia at times, just over 100 beats per minute, but not too much over 100, so nothing I think would be too alarming, like asystole. Okay, well, that's it for today. We looked at a EEG that had more or less continuous generalized periodic discharges, or GPDs, with triphasic morphology. They also had, I think I failed to mention this, hopefully not, but they also have a frontal predominance. In this case, you can also see GPDs that have a posterior predominance. Those are very frequent as well. In addition to that, we saw an anterior to posterior lag, an AP lag, and we also considered the sort of hybridized features where you can have GPDs with triphasic morphology that blend with features of GRDA, which is the acronym for generalized rhythmic delta activity. All right, thank you very much.